The rusted iron door swung open for the first time in 5 years, and Gwendolyn Lawson had to shield her eyes from the brightness of the afternoon sun that poured into the stone cellar where she had lived in darkness and fear. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the light, broad-shouldered and still, his hand extended toward her. She could not make out his face at first, only the outline of his worn leather hat and the glint of silver spurs at his boots. "The war is over, miss," he said quietly, his voice rough but kind. "You are safe now." Gwendolyn pressed herself against the cold wall, her body trembling. She had learned not to trust voices, not to trust promises. For 5 years, she had been locked away in this underground prison by men who claimed to be protecting her family's land while her father and brothers fought for the Confederacy. But those men had lied about everything. They had kept her here, alone in the dark, feeding her just enough to survive while they stripped her family's ranch of everything valuable. "I am not going to hurt you," the cowboy said, taking a cautious step forward. The light shifted, and she could see his face now. He was younger than his voice suggested, perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of the New Mexico sky at dusk. A scar ran along his jawline, but his expression was gentle. "My name is Quincy Foster. I have been searching for you for 3 months." "Searching for me," Gwendolyn whispered. Her voice cracked from disuse. She had not spoken to another human being in so long that the sound of her own words felt foreign. "Your brother Thomas sent me," Quincy said. "He survived the war. He came home to find the ranch taken over by outlaws and you missing. He has been half out of his mind with worry." At the mention of her brother, something broke inside Gwendolyn. She made a sound that was half sob, half gasp, and her legs gave out beneath her. Quincy moved quickly, crossing the cellar in 2 long strides and catching her before she hit the ground. His arms were strong and steady, and for the first time in 5 years, Gwendolyn felt something other than terror. "Thomas is alive," she managed to ask as Quincy lifted her carefully. She weighed almost nothing, her body weakened by years of poor food and no sunlight. "He is alive," Quincy confirmed, "and waiting for you in truth or consequences. That is where I have been staying while I tracked you down. The men who held you here scattered when word came that I was asking questions, but one of them got drunk in a saloon and talked too much. He told me about the cellar beneath the old mission." Gwendolyn blinked against the harsh light as Quincy carried her out of the cellar and into the ruins of what had once been a Spanish mission. The adobe walls were crumbling, and desert scrub grew wild through the courtyard. She could see his horse tied to a withered tree, a strong bay gelding with intelligent eyes. "Can you ride?" Quincy asked, though he could clearly see that she could barely hold herself upright. "I do not know," Gwendolyn admitted. "I have not walked more than a few steps in years." Quincy nodded, his jaw tightening with anger at what had been done to her. "Then you will ride with me. Truth or consequences is half a day's ride from here. We should reach it by nightfall." He settled her gently onto his horse before swinging up behind her. Gwendolyn tensed at the proximity, but Quincy kept his touch respectful, one arm loosely around her waist to keep her steady, the other hand holding the reins. As the horse began to move, she felt the warmth of the sun on her face for the first time in so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. The landscape around them was harsh and beautiful in equal measure. Red rock formations rose from the desert floor like ancient sentinels, and the air smelled of sage and dust. In the distance, mountains shimmered in the heat. It was September 1865, and the war that had torn the nation apart was finally over, but the scars it had left ran deep. "How did you find me?" Gwendolyn asked after they had ridden in silence for some time. Her voice was still weak, but she needed to understand. "Your brother hired me," Quincy explained. "I was a scout during the war, worked for both sides at different times depending on which way the wind was blowing. I know how to find people who do not want to be found. Thomas told me about the men who had claimed to be caretakers of your ranch, said they were all former Confederate deserters who had been using the war as cover for their crimes. I started asking questions in every town and outpost between here and El Paso. Eventually, I found a man who had ridden with them. He did not want to talk at first, but I convinced him." Gwendolyn noticed the way Quincy said that last part, the slight edge in his voice that suggested his methods of convincing had not been gentle. She found she did not care. These men had stolen 5 years of her life. "Why did they keep me alive?" she asked. "If they wanted the ranch, why not just kill me?" Quincy was quiet for a moment, and she felt his arm tighten slightly around her waist. "Your father put the land in your name before he left for the war," he said carefully. "Legal documents witnessed and recorded. If you died without signing it over, the land would go to the territorial government. They needed you alive so they could eventually force you to sign. They were waiting for the war to end, waiting for things to settle down so they could forge the right papers." The cruelty of it took Gwendolyn's breath away. They had kept her in that dark hole for 5 years simply as a living signature, a means to an end. Her hands began to shake, and Quincy noticed immediately. "You are safe now," he said again, his voice low and sincere. "I give you my word that no one will ever lock you away again." Gwendolyn wanted to believe him, but trust was a luxury she could no longer afford easily. She had been 19 years old when they had thrown her into that cellar, barely more than a girl. She was 24 now, and she felt ancient. As they rode, Quincy told her about Truth or Consequences, a rough mining town that had sprung up near natural hot springs. It was rowdy and loud, full of prospectors and drifters and people trying to start over after the war. Thomas had found work there as a blacksmith, rebuilding his life while he searched for his sister. "He will be so happy to see you," Quincy said. "He has blamed himself every day for leaving you behind." "He had to fight," Gwendolyn said softly. "Father made him go." "We all thought the war would be over in a few months." "A lot of people thought that," Quincy replied. "They were wrong." The sun was beginning to set when they finally saw the town in the distance, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around the hot springs. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Gwendolyn could hear the faint sound of a piano playing somewhere. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Quincy guided his horse down the main street, which was busy with evening activity. People glanced at them with curiosity, taking in the sight of the gaunt woman in tattered clothing riding with the stern-faced cowboy. Gwendolyn tried to shrink into herself, ashamed of her appearance, but Quincy seemed to sense her discomfort. "The blacksmith shop is just ahead," he said gently. "You are almost there." The shop was at the edge of town, a sturdy building with a forge that glowed orange in the gathering darkness. Quincy dismounted and carefully lifted Gwendolyn down. Her legs trembled as she tried to stand, and she would have fallen if he had not kept his hands on her arms. "Thomas," Quincy called out. "Come out here." A moment later, a man emerged from the shop, wiping his hands on a leather apron. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and the same green eyes that Gwendolyn saw when she looked in a mirror. Those eyes widened in shock when he saw her. "Gwen." Thomas whispered. Then, louder, his voice breaking, "Gwen!" He ran to her, and Gwendolyn found herself sobbing in her brother's arms, 5 years of grief and terror and loneliness pouring out of her all at once. Thomas held her tightly, murmuring her name over and over, and she could feel him shaking with emotion. "I thought you were dead," he kept saying. "I thought I had lost you." "I am here," Gwendolyn managed to say between sobs. I am here." Over Thomas's shoulder, she saw Quincy step back, giving them privacy. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that looked like satisfaction, as though he had completed a task that mattered deeply to him. Thomas finally pulled back enough to look at his sister's face, and his expression turned dark with rage when he saw how thin and pale she was. "What did they do to you?" he demanded. "They locked me in a cellar," Gwendolyn said, "beneath the old mission near our ranch. They kept me in the dark and gave me just enough food and water to survive. They said they would kill me if I tried to escape." Thomas's hands clenched into fists. "Where are they now? I will kill every last one of them." "They scattered," Quincy interjected quietly. "But I have names and descriptions. We can hunt them down if you want justice." "I want them dead," Thomas said flatly. "No," Gwendolyn surprised herself by saying. Both men looked at her. "No more death. I just want to be free of them. I want to forget they ever existed." Thomas looked like he wanted to argue, but then he saw the exhaustion in his sister's eyes and nodded slowly. "Whatever you need, Gwen. Whatever you need." He led her into his small living quarters behind the blacksmith shop, and Quincy followed. The room was sparse but clean, with a bed, a table, and a small stove. Thomas immediately began fussing over his sister, heating water for tea and finding blankets to wrap around her thin shoulders. "She needs a doctor," Quincy said, "and proper food. Her body has been starved for years." "I will fetch Doc Henderson," Thomas said. "Quincy, can you stay with her?" Quincy nodded and Thomas hurried out. The silence that followed felt heavy. Gwendolyn sat at the table, wrapped in blankets, and looked at the man who had rescued her. In the lamplight, she could see him more clearly. He was handsome in a rough way, with strong features and those remarkable blue-gray eyes. The scar on his jaw gave him a dangerous look, but his manner toward her had been nothing but gentle. "Thank you," she said softly, "for finding me, for bringing me back to Thomas." Quincy shook his head. "You do not need to thank me. I was paid to find you." "Still," Gwendolyn insisted, "you did not have to be kind. You could have just dragged me out of that cellar and dumped me on my brother's doorstep. But you were gentle with me. That matters." Something flickered in Quincy's expression, a vulnerability that he quickly masked. "I have seen enough cruelty in my life," he said. "I try not to add to it when I can help it." Before Gwendolyn could respond, Thomas returned with the doctor, a graying man with kind eyes and steady hands. Doc Henderson examined Gwendolyn thoroughly, asking questions about her captivity and making notes. His expression grew grimmer as the examination continued. "She is severely malnourished," he finally announced. "Her muscles have atrophied from lack of use, and she is showing signs of scurvy from vitamin deficiency. But she is young and strong. With proper food and care, she should recover in time." He left instructions and several bottles of tonic, refusing payment when Thomas tried to press money into his hands. "Just take care of your sister," he said. "That is payment enough." After the doctor left, Thomas made a simple soup from vegetables and salted pork. Gwendolyn ate slowly, her stomach unused to real food. Quincy sat quietly in the corner, seeming reluctant to leave despite his job being done. "Where will you go now?" Thomas asked him as Gwendolyn ate. Quincy shrugged. "I have no particular destination in mind. I go where the work takes me." "Stay," Thomas said impulsively. "Stay here in truth or consequences. I could use help in the shop, and you have earned more than what I already paid you." Quincy glanced at Gwendolyn, something unreadable in his eyes. "I do not know anything about blacksmithing." "I could teach you," Thomas offered. "Or you could find other work in town. There is always need for men who can handle themselves. The mine owners are constantly looking for security, and the sheriff could probably use a deputy." Gwendolyn found herself hoping that Quincy would stay. though she could not fully explain why. Perhaps it was because he represented safety, or because he was the first person in 5 years to treat her with genuine kindness. Or perhaps it was something else, something she was not ready to examine too closely. "I will think about it," Quincy said finally. "For tonight I will stay at the boarding house. Tomorrow we can talk more." He stood to leave, settling his hat on his head. At the door, he paused and looked back at Gwendolyn. "I am glad you are safe," he said simply, and then he was gone. Thomas helped Gwendolyn to the bed, and she lay down properly for the first time in 5 years. The mattress felt impossibly soft after so long on cold stone. Thomas sat beside her, holding her hand. "I am sorry I was not here to protect you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have stayed. I should have fought Father when he said I had to enlist." "You could not have known what would happen," Gwendolyn told him. "None of us could have known. Father and James did not make it," Thomas said quietly. "They died at Glorietta Pass in '62. I only survived because I was captured and spent 2 years in a Union prison camp. When I was finally released and came home, the ranch was overrun with those men and you were gone. They told me you had run off with some gambler, that you wanted nothing to do with the family anymore. I did not believe them, but I had no proof." Gwendolyn squeezed her brother's hand. "You found me. That is what matters." "Quincy found you," Thomas corrected. "I was about to give up hope when I met him. He was passing through town looking for work, and I mentioned my missing sister in passing. He said he could find people, that he had done it during the war. I did not really believe him, but I was desperate. I gave him what little money I had saved and descriptions of the men who had taken over the ranch. 3 months later, he came back with you." Gwendolyn thought about Quincy, about the careful way he had handled her, the respect in his voice. "He is a good man," she said softly. "He is dangerous," Thomas replied, though there was no condemnation in his tone. "I have seen men like him before. They do what needs to be done and they do not lose sleep over it. But yes, I think underneath all that, he is a good man." Gwendolyn drifted off to sleep with her brother watching over her, and for the first time in 5 years, she did not have nightmares. The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm. Thomas worked in his blacksmith shop during the day while Gwendolyn rested and slowly regained her strength. The doctor came by every few days to check on her progress, always pleased with what he saw. Gwendolyn's color improved, and she began to put on weight. More importantly, the haunted look in her eyes began to fade, replaced by something that resembled hope. Quincy did stay in town, taking a job as security for one of the larger mining operations. He would stop by the blacksmith shop in the evenings, ostensibly to talk business with Thomas, but Gwendolyn noticed that his eyes would seek her out as soon as he entered the room. They would talk sometimes, carefully neutral conversations about the town or the weather or nothing of consequence. But there was something building between them, a connection that neither of them quite knew how to name. One evening about 2 weeks after her rescue, Gwendolyn felt strong enough to step outside for the first time. Thomas had been reluctant, worried that she would push herself too hard, but she had insisted. Quincy happened to be visiting, and he offered to walk with her. The sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Gwendolyn stood in the doorway of the blacksmith shop, overwhelmed by the beauty of it. 5 years of darkness had made her forget how magnificent the world could be. "Take my arm," Quincy offered. "The ground is uneven." Gwendolyn accepted, looping her arm through his. Together they walked slowly down the street. It was still early evening and the town was alive with activity. Miners headed to the saloons, shopkeepers closed up for the night, and somewhere a dog barked. To Gwendolyn, it was all miraculous. "Are you all right?" Quincy asked after a few minutes. "We can turn back if you are tired." "No," Gwendolyn said. "I just need a moment. Everything is so much." They stopped near the edge of town where they could see the desert stretching out endlessly. The hot springs steamed in the cooling evening air, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I used to love watching the sunset," Gwendolyn said softly. "Before they locked me away, I would sit on the porch of our ranch house every evening and watch the sky change colors. I thought I would never see it again." Quincy was quiet for a moment. "What was it like?" he finally asked. "Being locked away for so long." Most people had been too polite or too uncomfortable to ask that question directly. Gwendolyn appreciated Quincy's honesty. "It was like being buried alive," she said. "The first few months were the worst. I screamed until my voice gave out. I threw myself against the door until my body was covered in bruises. I begged and pleaded every time they brought me food, but they never responded. Eventually, I stopped fighting. I just existed one day at a time, trying to hold on to who I was. I would recite poems my mother had taught me, sing songs to myself, anything to keep my mind from breaking." "But you survived," Quincy said. "You are stronger than you know." Gwendolyn shook her head. "I do not feel strong. I feel damaged, like something inside me is broken that can never be fixed." Quincy turned to face her, his expression serious. "You are not broken," he said firmly. "You are healing. There is a difference." "How can you be so sure?" Gwendolyn asked. "Because I have been broken before," Quincy replied. "During the war, I did things I am not proud of. I saw things that haunt me still. For a long time after it ended, I thought I was beyond redemption. But then I started helping people like your brother, finding their missing loved ones, bringing families back together. Each time I did, I felt a little more human again. You will find your way back too. It just takes time." There was such conviction in his voice that Gwendolyn found herself believing him. Without thinking, she reached up and touched the scar on his jaw. Quincy froze at the contact but did not pull away. "How did you get this?" she asked. "A Confederate officer caught me passing information to the Union," Quincy said. "He was going to shoot me, but one of his men intervened. They fought, and the officer's blade caught me across the face before I could escape." "You were a spy," Gwendolyn realized. "I was a survivor," Quincy corrected. "I did what I had to do to stay alive. The war was not about noble causes for men like me. It was about getting through each day and trying not to die." Gwendolyn let her hand drop, suddenly aware of how intimate the gesture had been. But Quincy caught her hand before it fell, holding it gently in his own. "I have never told anyone that story before," he said. "But I wanted you to know. I wanted you to understand that I know what it is like to carry shame for things beyond your control." "I am not ashamed," Gwendolyn said, though she knew it was not entirely true. Part of her did feel shame for having been so helpless, for having survived while others had not. "You should not be," Quincy said. "None of what happened to you was your fault." They stood there in the fading light, hands clasped, and Gwendolyn felt something shift inside her. It was not attraction exactly, though there was an element of that. It was recognition. She saw in Quincy someone who understood darkness, who had emerged from his own hell and was trying to build something better. "We should head back," Quincy said reluctantly. "Thomas will worry." They walked back to the blacksmith shop slowly, neither of them in a hurry to let go of the other's hand. Thomas was indeed waiting anxiously, but his concern turned to approval when he saw the color in his sister's cheeks and the light in her eyes. "The walk did you good," he observed. "It did," Gwendolyn agreed, glancing at Quincy. "Very good." After that evening, Quincy's visits became more frequent. He and Gwendolyn would talk for hours, sharing stories of their lives before the war. She learned that he had grown up on a ranch in Texas, the youngest of 5 brothers. His family had lost everything during the war, scattered to the winds. He had not seen any of them in years and did not know if they were alive or dead. Gwendolyn told him about her childhood on the ranch, about learning to ride before she could properly walk, about her mother who had died of fever when Gwendolyn was 12. She told him about her dreams of traveling, of seeing places beyond the desert. Those dreams had died in that cellar, but talking to Quincy, she felt them stirring again. Thomas watched this growing connection with mixed feelings. He liked Quincy and trusted him, but he also worried about his sister getting hurt. Gwendolyn had been through so much already. If this thing between her and Quincy went wrong, it might break her completely. But as the weeks passed, Thomas's concerns began to ease. Quincy was patient and respectful, never pushing Gwendolyn beyond what she was comfortable with. And Gwendolyn was blossoming under the attention. She smiled more. She laughed. She began to look forward to each day instead of simply enduring it. 1 month after her rescue, Gwendolyn was strong enough to ride a horse again. Quincy had been teaching her slowly, starting with just sitting on a gentle mare and working up to short rides around town. On a crisp October morning, he suggested they ride out to the hot springs. "There are pools away from town that are quiet and private," he said. "The water is supposed to be healing. I thought you might enjoy it." Thomas gave his permission, though he insisted Gwendolyn take a rifle with her. "Just in case," he said, though everyone knew the real danger had passed. The ride to the hot springs took about an hour. Gwendolyn was delighted to be on horseback again, feeling the rhythm of the animal beneath her and the wind in her hair. Quincy rode beside her on his bay gelding, pointing out landmarks and wildlife. They saw a coyote in the distance and a hawk circling overhead. The hot springs were located in a shallow canyon, surrounded by red rock formations. Steam rose from pools of clear water, and the air smelled of minerals and sage. Quincy had been right that it was private. They did not see another soul. "How did you find this place?" Gwendolyn asked as they dismounted. "I like to explore," Quincy said with a shrug. "I do not do well in towns for too long. I need open space and quiet to think." They sat on rocks near one of the smaller pools, their feet dangling in the warm water. It felt wonderful on Gwendolyn's still weak muscles, soothing and restorative. "Can I ask you something personal?" Quincy said after a while. "Yes," Gwendolyn replied. "You ever think about what you want to do next, after you have fully recovered?" Gwendolyn was quiet for a moment, considering. "I do not know," she admitted. "I have been so focused on healing that I have not thought much about the future. Thomas wants me to stay with him, help him build up the blacksmith business, but I do not know if that is what I want." "What do you want?" Quincy pressed gently. "I want to feel alive again," Gwendolyn said. "I want to do things that matter. I want to matter." "You matter," Quincy said immediately. "You matter a great deal." Gwendolyn looked at him, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Quincy," she began, but she did not know how to finish the sentence. He seemed to understand anyway. Slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, he leaned toward her. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and careful, a question more than a demand. Gwendolyn froze for just a moment, and then she was kissing him back, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. It was her first kiss, though she was 24 years old. Those 5 years in the cellar had stolen so much from her, including the normal progression of courtship and romance that other women her age had experienced. But this felt right. This felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from her. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Quincy rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "I am glad you did," Gwendolyn whispered. They sat there for a long time, not talking, just being together. Eventually, Quincy pulled back and looked at her seriously. "I need to tell you something," he said. I am not a good man, Gwendolyn. I have done terrible things. During the war and after, I have killed people. I have lied and stolen and betrayed trust when it suited my purposes. I am trying to be better, but my past does not just disappear. I do not need you to be perfect, Gwendolyn said. I just need you to be honest with me. Always, Quincy promised. I will always be honest with you. They rode back to town as the sun began to set, and Gwendolyn felt different somehow. Lighter, more hopeful than she had been since before her captivity. When they reached the blacksmith shop, Quincy helped her down from her horse and held her hand for a moment longer than necessary. "Can I see you tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes," Gwendolyn said. "Tomorrow and every day after if you want." "I want," Quincy said simply. Thomas noticed the change in his sister immediately. Over dinner, she was animated in a way he had not seen since she was a girl. She talked and laughed and asked questions about his work, and when Quincy's name came up, her whole face lit up. "You care for him," Thomas observed. "I do," Gwendolyn admitted. "Is that foolish, after everything that has happened?" "No," Thomas said thoughtfully. "I think it might be the wisest thing you could do. You deserve happiness, Gwen, and if Quincy can give that to you, then I am all for it." "You trust him?" Gwendolyn asked. "I do," Thomas said. "He has proven himself to be a man of his word. That counts for a lot in this world." As the weeks passed, Gwendolyn and Quincy's relationship deepened. They spent nearly every free moment together, talking and riding and simply enjoying each other's company. Quincy introduced her to his friends in town, and Gwendolyn began to build a social circle beyond just her brother. She started helping out at the local church, serving meals to people in need. It gave her a sense of purpose that she had been missing, but not everything was easy. Gwendolyn still had nightmares about the cellar, waking up in the middle of the night disoriented and terrified. Thomas learned to talk her through these episodes, reminding her where she was and that she was safe. She did not tell Quincy about the nightmares at first, ashamed of her continued weakness. But one evening, when they were sitting on the porch of the blacksmith shop watching the stars, Quincy asked her directly if she was sleeping well. "Sometimes," Gwendolyn hedged. "And other times," Quincy prompted. She sighed, knowing she could not lie to him. "Other times I wake up thinking I am back in that cellar. It takes me a while to remember that I am free." Quincy took her hand. "Have you talked to anyone about it? The doctor, maybe?" "What could he do?" Gwendolyn asked. "Give me laudanum to sleep. I do not want to be numb, I just want to forget." "Maybe you are not supposed to forget," Quincy said gently. "Maybe you are just supposed to learn to live with it, to make the memories smaller and less powerful over time." "Is that what you did?" Gwendolyn asked. "With your memories of the war?" "I am still working on it," Quincy admitted. "Some nights are better than others, but it helps to have something to look forward to, something that makes the future worth facing." He looked at her meaningfully, and Gwendolyn felt warmth spread through her chest. "You give me something to look forward to as well," she said softly. "Good," Quincy said. "Then we can face our demons together." In November, a letter arrived for Thomas from a lawyer in Santa Fe. The men who had held Gwendolyn captive had been tracked down and arrested. They were awaiting trial for kidnapping and theft. The lawyer wanted to know if Gwendolyn would be willing to testify against them. The thought of facing those men again made Gwendolyn physically ill, but Quincy and Thomas both assured her that she would not have to do it alone. "I will be right there with you," Quincy promised. Every step of the way. The trial was scheduled for early December. Quincy arranged for time away from his job at the mine, and Thomas closed the blacksmith shop for the week. The three of them traveled to Santa Fe together, a journey of several days by stagecoach. Santa Fe was much larger than Truth or Consequences, a bustling city that had been an important center during the war. The courthouse, was an imposing adobe building in the plaza. When they arrived, the lawyer met them and explained what would happen during the trial. "There are 4 defendants," he said. "All have been charged with kidnapping, theft, and conspiracy. Your testimony will be crucial to securing convictions." Gwendolyn felt her hands start to shake, but Quincy was there immediately, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "You can do this," he murmured. "You are the strongest person I know." The trial began the next morning. Gwendolyn sat in the courtroom between Quincy and Thomas, trying not to look at the men in shackles at the defendant's table, but she could feel their eyes on her, hostile and cold. When it was her turn to testify, Quincy walked with her to the witness stand. He could not stay there with her, but he gave her hand a squeeze before returning to his seat. The prosecutor asked her to describe what had happened, starting from the day she was taken. Gwendolyn's voice shook at first, but as she spoke, she found strength in telling her story. She described the cellar, the darkness, the fear. She described the meager food they had given her and the threats they had made. She described 5 years of isolation and terror. The defense attorney tried to discredit her, suggesting that she had gone willingly with the men and had only claimed kidnapping after the fact. But Gwendolyn held firm. She looked directly at the jury and told them the truth. "These men stole 5 years of my life," she said. "They locked me in darkness and treated me like a piece of property to be traded. I survived, but I will carry the scars of what they did for the rest of my days. I am asking you to hold them accountable for their crimes." The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. The defendants were sentenced to 20 years each in territorial prison. As they were led away, one of them spat in Gwendolyn's direction and cursed her. Quincy moved so fast that he was a blur, putting himself between the man and Gwendolyn, his hand on his pistol. "Say another word to her," he said in a voice like ice, "and I will make sure you do not live long enough to see the inside of that prison." The marshals dragged the man away, and Quincy turned back to Gwendolyn, his expression softening immediately. "Are you all right?" "I am better than all right," Gwendolyn said, surprised to find that it was true. "I feel like I can breathe again, like I have taken back something they stole." That evening they celebrated at a restaurant in Santa Fe. Thomas was in high spirits, buying rounds of drinks and toasting his sister's courage. But Quincy was quiet, watching Gwendolyn with an intensity that made her pulse race. "Walk with me," he asked after dinner. They strolled through the plaza, which was decorated for the upcoming Christmas season. Luminarias lined the walkways, and the smell of pinyon smoke filled the air. It was cold, and Gwendolyn pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I have been thinking," Quincy said as they walked. "About the future, about what I want." "And what do you want?" Gwendolyn asked. Quincy stopped walking and turned to face her. "I want you," he said simply. "I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to help you chase those dreams you told me about, the ones of traveling and seeing the world. I want everything with you, Gwendolyn." Gwendolyn's heart was pounding so hard she was sure Quincy could hear it. "That sounds like a proposal," she said breathlessly. "It is," Quincy confirmed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "I know I do not have much to offer. I am just a cowboy with a checkered past and an uncertain future. But I love you, Gwendolyn Lawson. I have loved you since the moment I found you in that cellar and saw the strength in your eyes. Will you marry me?" Gwendolyn did not even have to think about it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Quincy slipped the ring onto her finger and then kissed her, deep and passionate, right there in the plaza with people walking past and children playing nearby. Gwendolyn did not care who saw. She had spent 5 years hidden away in darkness. She wanted to live her life in the light now, openly and without fear. They returned to truth or consequences the next day and immediately began planning the wedding. Thomas was thrilled, already designing a set of horseshoes as a wedding gift. The whole town seemed caught up in the excitement, with people Gwendolyn barely knew offering congratulations and help. They were married on Christmas Eve in the small church at the center of town. Gwendolyn wore a simple white dress that the seamstress had made for her, and Quincy wore his best clothes, his hair neatly combed and his boots polished. Thomas walked his sister down the aisle, and there were tears in his eyes as he placed her hand in Quincy's. The ceremony was short and simple, but the words meant everything. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and Quincy kissed her, Gwendolyn felt like her heart might burst with happiness. Just 6 months ago, she had been locked in a cellar with no hope of escape. Now she was married to a man she loved, surrounded by people who cared about her, with a whole future stretching out before her. The reception was held at the saloon, which the owner had decorated with pine branches and candles. There was music and dancing and more food than Gwendolyn had seen in years. She danced with Quincy and with Thomas and with several of the miners who had become friends over the past months. As midnight approached, Quincy took her hand and led her outside. He had rented a small house on the edge of town for them to live in, a modest place with 2 rooms and a porch that looked out over the desert. It was not much, but it was theirs. "Welcome home, Mrs. Foster," Quincy said as he carried her over the threshold. Gwendolyn laughed, giddy with joy and champagne and the sheer impossibility of her happiness. Quincy set her down gently and then cupped her face in his hands. "I am going to spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you know how loved you are," he promised. "I already know," Gwendolyn said, but she did not mind hearing it again. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, both of them nervous in different ways. Quincy was patient, letting Gwendolyn set the pace, and she loved him even more for that. Afterward they lay tangled together in the darkness, and for the first time in 5 years, Gwendolyn felt completely safe. "Tell me about your dreams," Quincy said, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "The ones about traveling." "I used to want to see the ocean," Gwendolyn said. "And big cities like San Francisco and New Orleans. I wanted to ride on a steamship and stay in fancy hotels and eat food I could not even pronounce." "Then that is what we will do," Quincy said. "I have been saving money. Not a lot, but enough to start. We could go to San Francisco next summer. I could find work there and we could stay for a few months." Gwendolyn propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "Are you serious?" "Completely," Quincy said. "You have spent too much of your life locked away. I want to give you the world." Gwendolyn kissed him, pouring all of her love and gratitude into the gesture. "I do not need the world," she said. "I just need you." "You have me," Quincy promised. "Always." The winter passed in a blur of happiness. Gwendolyn settled into married life with ease, discovering that she loved keeping a home and cooking for Quincy. He taught her to shoot properly, insisting that she should be able to defend herself. She proved to be a natural, her aim steady and true. Quincy continued working at the mine, but he was already making plans for their trip to California. He picked up extra shifts and took on side jobs, saving every penny. Gwendolyn started taking in sewing to contribute, and together they slowly built up their travel fund. In March, Thomas announced that he was planning to expand the blacksmith shop. Business had been good and he wanted to hire an apprentice. He offered Quincy the job first, but Quincy declined. "I appreciate it," he said, "but I am not cut out for settling down into steady work like that. I need to be able to move to have freedom. It is just who I am." Thomas understood, though Gwendolyn worried sometimes that Quincy would grow restless in their small life. But whenever those fears surfaced, Quincy would reassure her. "I am not going anywhere without you," he would say. "My wandering days are over. Now I just want to wander with you by my side." In April, Gwendolyn discovered she was pregnant. The news was both thrilling and terrifying. She had not thought much about children, too focused on recovering from her ordeal and building her marriage. But now that it was happening, she found herself excited. Quincy was over the moon. He immediately became overprotective, insisting that Gwendolyn rest more and do less heavy work. She found it endearing, even when it became annoying. "I am pregnant, not dying," she reminded him when he tried to stop her from hanging laundry. "I know," Quincy said, "but I want to take care of you. Let me do this." How could she argue with that? They postponed their trip to San Francisco, deciding to wait until after the baby was born. Gwendolyn was disappointed but practical. Traveling while pregnant would be difficult, and they would need the money for the baby anyway. As her pregnancy progressed, Gwendolyn found herself thinking more about her mother, wishing she were still alive to offer advice and support. But Thomas stepped up, sharing stories their mother had told him about when she was pregnant with Gwendolyn. And the women in town, who had been friendly but distant before, now embraced Gwendolyn fully. They threw her a party and showered her with handmade baby clothes and blankets. Quincy built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth as glass. He worked on it every evening, his hands careful and precise. Watching him, Gwendolyn felt overwhelmed with love. This man, who had once been a wandering cowboy and spy, was now preparing to be a father with the same intensity he brought to everything else. "What if I am not good at this?" Quincy asked one evening as he fitted the cradle together. "What if I do not know how to be a father?" "Then we will figure it out together," Gwendolyn said, "just like we have figured out everything else." The baby came in early December, almost exactly a year after Gwendolyn and Quincy's wedding. Labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Gwendolyn thought she might not survive. But Doc Henderson was skilled, and Quincy was there the whole time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. When their son finally entered the world, squalling and red-faced, Gwendolyn burst into tears. Quincy cut the cord with shaking hands, and then the doctor placed the baby on Gwendolyn's chest. She looked down at the tiny life they had created and felt something shift fundamentally inside her. This was what it felt like to be whole again. They named him James Thomas Foster, after both of their fathers. He had dark hair like Gwendolyn and blue-gray eyes like Quincy. He was perfect. The first few months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful and terrifying all at once. James was a fussy baby who did not sleep well, and both Gwendolyn and Quincy stumbled through those early weeks in a haze of sleeplessness. But they did it together, taking turns walking James around the house in the middle of the night and supporting each other when things got overwhelming. Thomas was a devoted uncle, stopping by every day to check on his sister and nephew. He carved wooden toys for James and told him stories about the Lawson family. Watching her brother with her son, Gwendolyn felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had both survived so much, lost so much. But they had found their way back to each other and built new families from the ashes of the old. As James grew from an infant into a toddler, Gwendolyn's nightmares about the cellar became less frequent. She still had bad nights occasionally, but Quincy was always there to hold her and remind her that she was safe. And increasingly, the good memories outnumbered the bad. She had a husband who loved her fiercely, a son who delighted her every day, and a life full of purpose and connection. When James was 2 years old, Quincy brought up the idea of traveling again. They had saved enough money for a trip to San Francisco, and James was old enough to handle the journey. "Are you sure?" Gwendolyn asked. "It will be expensive to travel with a child." "I am sure," Quincy said. I promised you I would show you the world. It is time I made good on that promise." They spent the summer of 1868 in San Francisco, and it was everything Gwendolyn had dreamed of and more. The city was bustling and diverse, full of people from all over the world. They stayed in a modest hotel near the waterfront and spent their days exploring. Gwendolyn saw the ocean for the first time and wept at its vastness. They rode the cable cars and ate at restaurants serving food from China and Italy and France. They took James to the park and watched him chase seagulls, shrieking with laughter. Quincy found temporary work at the docks, and they stayed for 3 months before money ran low and they had to return to truth or consequences. But the trip had been transformative. Gwendolyn had proven to herself that she could venture far from home and not just survive but thrive. The world was no longer a frightening place but one full of possibility. Back in New Mexico, they settled into a comfortable routine. Quincy took a job as a deputy sheriff, using his skills from the war to help maintain order in the growing town. Gwendolyn became active in the church community, organizing charity drives and teaching Sunday school. James started school and proved to be a bright, curious child. In 1870, Gwendolyn became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and their daughter was born in the spring. They named her Clara Rose, and she had Gwendolyn's green eyes and a sweet, placid temperament that was the opposite of her brother's. With 2 children, travel became more complicated, but Quincy was determined to keep showing his family the world. When Clara was 3, they took a trip to New Orleans, traveling by train. James and Clara were endlessly fascinated by everything they saw, and Gwendolyn loved experiencing it all through their eyes. Thomas married in 1872, a widow named Margaret who had 2 children of her own. The expanded family meant that Gwendolyn had even more people to love and care for. Holiday gatherings became loud, chaotic affairs with children running everywhere and adults trying to carry on conversations over the noise. It was wonderful. As the years passed, truth or consequences grew and changed. The mining boom eventually faded, but the town found new life as a destination for people seeking the healing waters of the hot springs. New businesses opened, and the population became more diverse. Quincy eventually left the sheriff's office to open a guide service, taking wealthy tourists on trips into the desert and mountains. It suited him better than law enforcement, allowing him to be outdoors and on the move while still coming home to his family every night. Gwendolyn never fully forgot what had been done to her. The scars were too deep for that, but she learned to live with those memories, to make them part of her story without letting them define her. She became known in the community as someone who helped other women who had experienced trauma, offering a sympathetic ear and practical support. One evening in 1875, when James was 10 and Clara was 5, a young woman came to Gwendolyn's door. She was bruised and frightened, having just escaped from a man who had been holding her against her will. Gwendolyn took her in without hesitation, gave her food and shelter, and helped her contact the authorities. The woman stayed with them for 2 weeks while arrangements were made for her safe passage to family in Colorado. "How can you do this?" the woman asked the night before she left. "Help someone like me when you have been through so much yourself." "Because I know what it is like to be where you are," Gwendolyn said. "And I know how much it means to have someone believe you and support you. If I can give that to someone else, then something good has come from what happened to me." Quincy, who had been listening from the doorway, came over and wrapped his arms around his wife. "You are the bravest person I have ever known," he said. Over the next several years, Gwendolyn helped dozens of women, working with the sheriff and local clergy to create a network of support for those fleeing abuse or trafficking. It became her life's work, the thing that gave her the deepest sense of purpose. In 1880, when Gwendolyn was 35 and Quincy was 39, they took their biggest trip yet. They traveled all the way to New York City, taking James and Clara with them. They spent a month exploring the city, visiting museums and theaters and riding the elevated railway. For Gwendolyn, who had once thought she would never leave that cellar, standing at the top of a tall building and looking out over the vast city was almost overwhelming. She had come so far, survived so much. "Are you happy?" Quincy asked her one evening as they stood on the balcony of their hotel, watching the sun set over the harbor. "Yes," Gwendolyn said without hesitation. "I am happier than I ever thought possible." "Good," Quincy said, pulling her close, "because you deserve every bit of happiness in the world." They returned to Truth or Consequences that fall, and Gwendolyn threw herself back into her work with renewed energy. She and several other women formed an official organization to help women and children in danger. They raised money to purchase a house that could serve as a safe haven, and Quincy helped them set up security measures to keep the residents safe. The children grew up healthy and strong. James became a teacher, passionate about education and justice. Clara became a nurse, wanting to help heal people the way her mother had been healed. Both of them married well and had children of their own, giving Gwendolyn and Quincy a brood of grandchildren to dote on. Thomas lived until 1890, passing peacefully in his sleep at the age of 53. His death hit Gwendolyn hard. He had been her rock through everything, the one constant in her life. But she took comfort in the fact that he had lived to see her happy and settled, that he had known his sacrifice during the war had not been in vain. Quincy remained healthy and active well into his 60s, still taking tourists on desert expeditions and teaching his grandchildren to ride and shoot. He and Gwendolyn grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They still took trips when they could, though they did not venture as far from home as they once had. Mostly, they were content to sit on their porch in the evenings, watching the sunset and talking about their day. "You ever regret it?" Gwendolyn asked him one evening in 1895. They were both 60 now, their hair gray and their bodies slower than they once were. "Tying yourself to a damaged woman all those years ago." Quincy turned to look at her, and the love in his eyes was as strong as it had been on their wedding day. "Never," he said firmly. "Finding you, loving you, building this life with you has been the greatest privilege of my existence. You are not damaged, Gwendolyn. You are a survivor, and I am honored to have been part of your survival." Gwendolyn reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining automatically after so many years together. "I would not have survived without you," she said. "You gave me a reason to keep fighting, to keep believing that life could be good again." "We saved each other," Quincy said. "That is what love does." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, the same colors Gwendolyn had thought she would never see again during those dark years in the cellar. But she had seen them, had lived to build a beautiful life full of love and purpose and connection. The war was over, had been over for 30 years. But more than that, her personal war was over too. She had fought her way back from darkness and claimed a life worth living. As the stars began to appear in the deepening twilight, Gwendolyn leaned her head on Quincy's shoulder and thought about the young woman she had been when he first found her, broken and terrified and barely clinging to hope. She thought about the moment when he had extended his hand and told her the war was over, how she had been too frightened to take it at first. But she had taken it eventually, and that single act of trust had changed everything. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" Quincy asked. "For taking my hand," Gwendolyn said, "for not giving up on me even when I had given up on myself, for showing me that life after trauma is not just possible but can be beautiful." Quincy kissed the top of her head. "I would do it all again in a heartbeat," he said. "Every single moment." They remained on the porch until full darkness fell. Two people who had found each other in the aftermath of war and built something lasting from the ruins. Around them, their grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter ringing out in the night. Inside the house, Clara was preparing dinner while James argued politics with his brother-in-law. It was chaotic and loud and perfect. This was what healing looked like, Gwendolyn thought. Not the absence of scars, but the presence of love and family and purpose. She had been locked away for 5 years, had thought her life was over. But Quincy had told her the war was over and taken her hand, and together they had built something neither of them could have imagined. As they finally rose to go inside for dinner, Gwendolyn paused to look up at the stars. They were the same stars that had shone above her during those years of captivity, the same stars she had imagined looking at from the other side of the world. She had made it to the other side in every sense that mattered. She was free, she was loved, and she was home. Coming. Quincy called from the doorway, his hand extended toward her once again. "Yes," Gwendolyn said, taking his hand as she had so many times before. "I am right behind you." Together, they walked into the warmth and light of their home, surrounded by the family they had built and the life they had fought for. The past would always be part of Gwendolyn's story, but it no longer controlled her present or limited her future. She had survived, she had healed, and she had loved. And that, she thought as Quincy pulled out her chair at the dinner table and their grandchildren clamored for her attention, was more than enough. The years continued to pass gently, marked by the changing of seasons and the steady rhythm of family life. Gwendolyn and Quincy celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in 1895 with a small party attended by all their children, grandchildren, and friends from around Truth or Consequences. The house was full of flowers and music, and the kind of comfortable chaos that comes from having multiple generations under one roof. James gave a speech about his parents, talking about how their love had been an example to him throughout his life. Clara sang a song she had written for them, her voice clear and sweet, and when Quincy stood to say a few words, his voice was rough with emotion. 30 years ago, he said, looking at Gwendolyn, I was a man with no home and no family, wandering from place to place looking for purpose. Your brother asked me to find you, and I thought it would just be another job. But the moment I saw you, something in me recognized something in you. We were both survivors, both scarred by war in different ways. I knew that if I could save you, maybe I could save myself too. And I was right. You have been my salvation, Gwendolyn Foster. You and the life we built together. There was not a dry eye in the room, including Gwendolyn's. She stood and embraced her husband, feeling the solid warmth of him and the steady beat of his heart. 30 years of marriage, 2 children, 5 grandchildren, and countless memories. It was more than she had ever dared to dream. The organization Gwendolyn had helped found continued to grow and expand, eventually opening 3 more safe houses throughout New Mexico territory. By the time statehood came in 1912, the network was recognized across the Southwest as a model for helping women and children escape dangerous situations. Gwendolyn served on the board until she was well into her 70s, always insisting that her own experience gave her unique insight into what survivors needed most. Quincy remained active in the community as well, serving briefly as mayor of Truth or Consequences in the early 1900s. He used his position to advocate for better law enforcement, training and handling cases of domestic abuse and kidnapping. The two of them became something of local legends, the couple who had found love in the aftermath of tragedy and spent their lives helping others do the same. In 1905, on their 40th anniversary, their children organized a surprise celebration at the town hall. It seemed like everyone in Truth or Consequences turned out for it, along with people from surrounding communities who had been helped by Gwendolyn's organization over the years. There were testimonials from women who credited Gwendolyn with saving their lives, stories about Quincy's fairness and integrity as a lawman and mayor, and a general outpouring of love and respect. "I cannot believe all these people came," Gwendolyn whispered to Quincy as they sat at the head table, overwhelmed by the turnout. "They came because you made a difference in their lives," Quincy said. "Because we made a difference. That matters." As the evening wore on and people shared their stories, Gwendolyn was struck by how many lives had been touched by their work. Dozens of women had passed through the safe houses. Countless children had been protected. Families had been reunited. Abusers had been held accountable, and systems had been changed for the better. It was a legacy that extended far beyond just their own family. When it was time for Gwendolyn and Quincy to speak, they stood together at the front of the hall. Quincy spoke first, thanking everyone for coming and for their support over the years. Then Gwendolyn took a deep breath and addressed the crowd. "When I was 19 years old," she said, "terrible people locked me away in darkness. For 5 years I lived without hope, believing my life was effectively over. But then Quincy found me and told me the war was over and took my hand. In that moment, everything changed. He showed me that survival was not the end but the beginning, that I could not only heal but thrive. That I could take my pain and transform it into purpose." She paused, looking out at the assembled crowd. "Every person in this room has faced their own darkness at some point. Some of you have faced horrors that would have broken most people. But you are here. You survived. And that matters. Your survival matters. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." The applause was thunderous, and as Gwendolyn sat down, she felt Quincy's hand find hers under the table. After 40 years, his touch still brought her comfort and strength. The years began to take their toll eventually. Quincy developed arthritis that made riding difficult, and Gwendolyn's eyesight began to fail. They slowed down, spending more time at home and less traveling. But they were content. They had lived full lives, loved deeply, and made a real difference in the world. What more could anyone ask for? In 1910, as they sat on their porch watching yet another sunset, Quincy turned to Gwendolyn and said, "If I had it to do over again, I would not change a single thing." "Not even the hard parts?" Gwendolyn asked. "Especially not the hard parts," Quincy said. "Because those were what taught us how to love each other properly, how to be patient and kind and strong for each other. Easy love is nice, but love that has been tested and proven is something else entirely." Gwendolyn squeezed his hand. "I love you, Quincy Foster. I have loved you for 45 years, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Quincy replied. "My brave, beautiful, remarkable wife." They remained together until the end, dying within 6 months of each other in 1915. Quincy went first, passing peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74. Gwendolyn followed that fall, her body simply giving out without him. She was 70 years old and had lived a life beyond anything she could have imagined during those dark years in the cellar. Their funeral was one of the largest Truth or Consequences had ever seen. People came from all over New Mexico and beyond to pay their respects to the couple who had touched so many lives. They were buried side by side in the town cemetery, their headstones bearing simple inscriptions. Quincy's read, "Beloved husband, father, and friend." Gwendolyn's read, "She survived and helped others do the same." but their true legacy lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the organization that continued to help women and children, in the changed laws and improved systems they had fought for. It lived on in every person who had been inspired by their story to fight back against their own darkness, to believe that healing and happiness were possible even after trauma. Years later, Clara would tell her own grandchildren about their great-grandparents, about the cowboy who had rescued a woman from a cellar, and the love story that grew from that moment. She would tell them about the importance of courage and compassion, of using your pain to help others, of never giving up hope even in the darkest times. And those children would carry those lessons forward, generation after generation, ensuring that Gwendolyn and Quincy's story never truly ended. Because love like theirs did not die with the body. It lived on in the hearts and minds of everyone they had touched, rippling outward through time like waves on a still pond. The cellar where Gwendolyn had been held was eventually torn down, the mission ruins cleared away to make room for new development. But before it was demolished, Gwendolyn had visited it one last time in 1912. She was 67 years old then, and walking was difficult, but she had wanted to face that place one more time. Quincy had gone with her, holding her arm as they descended the crumbling steps. The cellar was exactly as she remembered it, dark and cold and oppressive. But standing there as an old woman, surrounded by family and love and a lifetime of accomplishments, it looked smaller somehow, less powerful. "This is where it started," Gwendolyn had said quietly. "The worst years of my life happened in this space. But also the beginning of the best years, because this is where you found me. I would search 1,000 cellars to find you," Quincy had said, 1,000 lifetimes to love you." Gwendolyn had smiled then, and together they had climbed back up into the sunlight, leaving the darkness behind for good. That cellar had held her body for 5 years, but it had never truly captured her spirit. That had remained free, waiting for the right moment and the right person to help it soar again. And soar it did, for 50 years with Quincy by her side, creating a love story for the ages. A story of survival and healing, of taking broken pieces and making something beautiful from them. A story that proved that no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes eventually. All you have to do is hold on long enough to see it, and have the courage to take the hand that reaches out to guide you home.